Hi, it's Sam. So I'm going to talk to you today about the recent transit of Mars. Mars is now exalted. He's in Capricorn, um, and he just moved into Capricorn on the 8th of January, early in the morning. And not only did Mars move into Capricorn on January 8th, but Mercury also changed signs earlier the day before. See, we had two planets changing signs. Mercury and Mars both changed actually on Friday, and then on Saturday they were still just getting established in the sign, especially Mars. Mars was less than 1 degree of Capricorn on Saturday morning, and I'm talking about this because it illustrates a pretty important principle in Vedic astrology. It's very stressed, which is when planets change signs, they become unreliable. It's what's called sandhi. It's the way to look at it is, let's say that you're moving and you're moving into a new house, and let's say it's like the day that you're moving day. Well, what happens on moving day? You have half your stuff in your old house and half the stuff in the new house, and you're kind of in between. You're sort of going back and forth. You don't have all your stuff together, and you might be a little scattered, so to speak. And that's sort of what happens when planets change signs. They're unreliable, unpredictable. And of course, if they're planets like Mars, which is one of the cruel planets, then it can make for unpredictable, explosive, irrational behavior. Now, of course, that's not all it rules. When people say, oh, but that, Mars brings this, that's not the only thing Mars brings. But when you see that thing, it comes from Mars. When you see anger and hostility and violence, Mars is the planet that activates that. But of course, when that energy is elevated and transmuted into higher dimensions, it becomes discipline, courage, independence, right? Those things also come from Mars. And in fact, each of the planets have this evolutionary process involved with them. What happens is when we're not acting with discipline and courage and independence, we become frustrated, and then we become angry and we lash out. So this is always something that needs to be understood with any astrological placement, and that includes the good ones too. They have a higher intention, which is always something enlightened. They're all forces of wisdom and light and love. And when they're expressed in detriment, then they give difficulty. And that includes ones like Venus and the Moon and Jupiter, the gentle planets also. Venus and the Moon, for instance, give love, connection, peace. But when we don't have those things, they become lazy, passive-aggressive. They lead to problems that have to do with sort of self-medication and pacification, like, for instance, overeating, laziness. These are also big problems in life. Now, these are problems that usually hurt us rather than hurt others, but it's the same thing. Passive aggression is difficult no matter how you deal with it, or if someone is just kind of lazy or unempowered or, sort of medicating themselves through certain habits, that's going to be as destructive as someone who lashes out and gets angry and fights, which is the problem with Mars. The difference between what are called the benefics or the gentle planets and the cruel planets is when the cruel planets have weakness, they act with cruelty. When the gentle planets, and actually that usually those cruel actions are inflicted upon another or inflicted on the world, whereas the gentle planets, when they're suffering, they generally make us suffer. They hold on to the difficult thing, and we suffer as a result. Like, we feel bad about ourselves, and we do things that are self-destructive rather than destructive to others. That's just a general principle, but the reason I'm talking about this now is because you'll often see when planets change signs, what they rule acts unpredictably, and it can act in detriment. So, for instance, Mars changing signs, especially when he's moving into a place of exaltation. Mars is exalted here, which means he's really strong, and he's coming from another place of strength. So this place in the zodiac from Sagittarius to Capricorn is where Mars is really the most powerful, because he's actually coming from Scorpio, which is a sign he rules, then to Sagittarius, which is a sign ruled by Jupiter, his best friend, to a sign where he's exalted. So Mars is really powerful, and he has been for several months. So especially the transition from Sagittarius into Capricorn is one where Mars is really ready to kick some butt now, and he is for the next month or so until February 14th. But on Saturday, this is the chart for Tucson, Arizona, 10:15 Saturday. Now, of course, I have this chart up because this is the chart of the tragic shooting of the congresswoman in Tucson on Saturday. Mars had just changed signs. It was less than 1 degree in an unpredictable state. Now, you can just project this directly onto the person who did this act. What it means is that when the planets change and when they move in our environment, of course, it affects all of us. So if someone is like unbalanced towards something, diabolical, this transit could really affect him. Now, I don't have his chart. I didn't even look for it. I'm not doing this really to highlight that so much, but just to show that this is the chart of that moment. And you can see with Mars changing signs, there would be a tendency to kind of snap. Over the weekend, there was a couple other pretty violent shootings, one in Baltimore in a nightclub and other things like that. So there's a tendency for sort of unpredictable violent episodes, or unpredictable episodes in general when planets change signs. So we see this happen on Saturday, unfortunately, right when the moon had just gone over this a couple hours earlier. So probably when this crazed person was planning to go do this thing and getting it together is right when the rising sign went over Mars in the sky. Then it went into Aquarius, and this is when he perpetrated the act. Of course, the moon is right on the ascendant as well. You'll see this often in what are called electional charts, where the moon is a really powerful trigger because the moon is our mind in the moment. So in the local chart, the moment that the act was perpetrated, the moon was very close to the ascendant. And things like assassinations are potential now, or these kind of activities, because we still have Rahu and also Mercury in Mula Nakshatra. And I said a month ago when I did the video on Mercury retrograde and the cycle of Mercury that there's a potential for shootings and assassinations. Now, we didn't have it so much because we had both of these planets, Jupiter and Venus, who was just in Libra, were preventing a lot of the harshness of this potential with all these planets in Sagittarius and the eclipses with the planets in Mula and all of that. I said back in those videos that we have a lot of grace operating with Jupiter in Pisces and Venus in Libra, and we have. And so a lot of the potential difficulty didn't happen, which includes like a standoff in the Korean Peninsula, a lot of other things that were potentially dangerous that didn't happen. But since Venus has moved, one of the benefic planets is not supporting through grace anymore. Venus is in Scorpio, and Mars is now exalted. So we might see some violent, bloody things happen for the next few weeks for sure, because Venus is no longer in Libra, bringing diplomacy and moderation and things like that. And with Mars now exalted, is a bit unhinged. We also have Mercury and Rahu are both in this nakshatra of Mula now, and actually Mercury's moving pretty fast because he was just retrograde, but you see this trigger happen on Saturday morning and also over the weekend in general. So this is a sort of lesson of what happens when planets change signs, and that we have this exalted Mars now for the next month and a half or so, until February 14th, actually about the next month or so. So until February 14th, we have exalted Mars from January 8th to February 14th. And it gives, as I said, discipline, courage, independence, but also anger and hostility if you're not acting with discipline, courage, and independence. Now, I'm going to say this too. Often you'll hear where people say Saturn is related to discipline, and I disagree, because it's really the way you define discipline. Discipline is a choice you make in the moment. That's what gives you discipline. Saturn is about determination, which means hanging in there, not giving up. Saturn is about longevity and things that happen for a long time and making a plan, making a commitment, all of those things. Now you might say it takes discipline to be committed. Okay, maybe. But what discipline is really about is the choice you make in the moment, and that's related to Mars. I'll give you an example. It takes discipline to do what you know is right, to put it into practice. That's what Mars is. The reason we get frustrated is because we're not disciplined enough to do what we know is right. In fact, when we're undisciplined, instead of doing what we know is right and actually putting it into practice, we argue about what's right. And we get frustrated, really, because we're not able to live up to our own standard of righteousness. So, like I say often, when Mars is powerful, we're actually disciplined enough to put into practice what we know is right. When Mars is not strong, rather than putting into practice what we know is right, we argue with others over it. So, Mars is the capacity to suffer for our principles. That's what it is. And I'll give you an example of what the suffering is. Mars and Venus are opposite each other. Like, for instance, Mars rules Aries, Venus rules Libra, the sign opposite. Mars rules Scorpio, Venus rules Taurus, the sign opposite. So Mars and Venus are opposite. Venus wants to make us comfortable and happy. Venus is the part of you that wants to enjoy life. Mars wants to make you strong and tough. And like I said, walk the talk. Put your principles into action. That's Mars. So they're always opposite each other. And the way you recognize this is most of the time, or much of the time, let's say when you're sitting down to eat a meal, Venus part of you wants to enjoy the meal. Eat the food that tastes the best. And eat a lot of it if you're enjoying it. Eat more. Eat dessert. Food tastes good. Life is enjoyable. Enjoy it. Most of us eat food based on what we want to taste, not based on what's the best thing for me, what's going to make me the strongest, what's the food my body really needs, what's the right food to eat. That's Mars. That's the approach of Mars. Mars is the part of you that after you eat too much and you feel weak and like a kind of fat slob because you ate 3 pieces of cheesecake, you're kind of angry at yourself and you're kind of cranky and you're kind of just irritable because you get all this heavy food in your stomach and you're kind of lethargic and you're a little grouchy. Mars is the part of you that's grouchy. You probably wouldn't be grouchy if you ate the proper amount of food, the proper food your body needs. Maybe you had a little dessert, but you had a little bit. You only need a little bit. Like one of my teachers says, you don't need to eat a whole bag of sugar in order to enjoy sugar. A little bit is enough, a little sweetness. So Mars is the part of you that does what's right, not does what's easy or does what feels good. When Mars is powerful, a person has discipline, which is discipline is in the moment. The moment. For instance, we all know we'd probably be a lot better off if we woke up an hour earlier, let's say, and did a little exercise and did a little meditation and prepared our day that way. We wake up, instead of waking up at 6 o'clock at the very last minute to get in the shower and roll out of the house just in time. If we actually got up at 5 a.m., took things a little slower, did some meditation, some mindfulness, some alone time, and started our day that way, we'd be a lot better off. We all know it. But do we do it? Probably not. Why? Because that alarm goes off and I'm sleeping in bed and it feels so good to just lay here and be comfortable. That's Venus. Venus is the part of you that wants to be comfortable, wants to enjoy life. Mars is the part of you, if Mars is powerful, Mars will jump up out of the bed and say, no, I'm comfortable, but this is what's right. This is the right thing to do, and I'm willing to suffer for what's right, which means I'm willing to get up out of the comfortable bed in order to do what's right and what's going to make me strong. How do you think that would change your life? How do you think that would change your life if in all areas of life you actually did what you knew was right? And we kind of know what's right. We just don't do it. We're just not strong enough to do it. A powerful Mars, and you're strong enough to do it. You have the discipline. The discipline to get your butt out of bed earlier. The discipline to eat the food that's right for you and only the proper amount. Maybe a little extra once in a while, but at that point, it's not hurting you. That's discipline, is your choice in the moment. In this way, Mars gives discipline. That's what discipline is. It's the struggle between Mars and Venus, like I said. We have to make that choice in the moment. Your life is a series of moments, and much of the time that moment is a choice between Mars and Venus. What's right? What's going to make me happiest? What's right? What's going to make me happy? Especially with the senses, because that's Venus. So ponder those things a little bit and realize that exalted Mars is a time when, between January 8 and February 14, where you can really put that sense of righteousness into practice. In Vedic astrology, in the Vedic teachings, they say Mars gives strength. They just use the word strength. And that's true strength, is to do what you know is right. As I say, when Mars is powerful, we're willing to suffer for our principles because we know it's right. When Mars is not, we're willing to make others suffer for our principles in the form of our righteousness and our opinions and our arguments. So ponder those things and leave some comments. Let me know what you think.